As Seeds of Renewal patch 10.2.5 reels in and we begin to come towards the end of the expansion and head into the World Soul Saga and what's to come for this new era of World of Warcraft, I began to reflect on Dragonflight as an expansion and how my previous very negative opinion of retail WoW for the past few years has changed from a pretty bad place to one where I'm just sort of now like, retail is okay, you know. And whilst that might seem like a little underwhelming, it's a far cry and much better place to be in than the overwhelmingly negative opinions I had of retail WoW prior to Dragonflight's release. So one might ask, in many ways, has Dragonflight saved retail WoW in getting it back into a healthy state in preparation for the World Soul Saga? But just before we jump in, as always, feel free to like and subscribe if you're new here, as it helps me out a bunch. So thanks very much indeed. Now, let's get on with it. So I think it's fair to say, in retail WoW, there had been repeating issues with Battle for Azeroth and Shadowlands throughout their tenure, and they're typically looked upon as expansions that didn't really serve the player base, alongside a host of in-house issues for Blizzard as a company at the time. And as a result, for a lot of people, it did really become the dark days for retail WoW, with a mixture of vibes to the expansions not feeling like World of Warcraft, through retconned lore and questionable character decisions, as well as horrible gameplay issues, alongside the feast of dailies that guilted you into missing time with your family, and as a result, a game which originally people actively avoided their social lives to then play by choice, instead became a game that demanded you give up your social life just to keep up with the day-to-day mechanics of the game. Now once again throw that in with a sprinkle of terrible retconning with the jailer, and then a somewhat ambiguous and strange trailer for Dragonflight that didn't really get many people's gears going. It's fair to say that the folks who heavily invested in retail WoW began to somewhat question their seemingly undying faith in the series. Yet, now we've nearly got to experience Dragonflight as a full expansion, besides the last few patches incoming that really tie things up. It's been a generally decent expansion that's made a lot of good decisions in terms of gameplay, with a storyline that, while not blockbuster in any sense, I think did enough to serve what the expansion was in the end. A generous bridge to get us to the other side of what's to come whilst keeping players interested. But Dragonflight is by no means a perfect expansion. There's still been a bit of a hangover with a few confusing moments, mainly found in cinematics that should have built characters or villains up, yet instead focused on lackluster emotions and over-the-top suits of deep meaningful chats and loving embraces, sometimes almost not making the payoff worth it, such as Chromie hugging Nosdormu, or the disgusting end cinematic for what was a really great raid in a Majorsil. And as always, that glaring point of the Dragon Isles awakening for an unknown reason, but who cares? Another key issue with Dragonflight is quite unfortunate as well, is that the dragons and the dragon aspects, to me, didn't feel like they had much of an impact in the entire expansion, which is a quite strange factor to an expansion labelled Dragonflight. Now maybe it's because I don't really care for the characters all that much in the dragon aspects, and far more enjoyed the villains of this expansion, and the overall arc becoming more obvious that this expansion is setting up the future of WoW. But it's a factor that I know bothered a lot of people. Yet for myself, I admit it didn't really catch me out all that much. So I still think overall Dragonflight really did steady the ship and pull retail WoW back from the depths that it was truly in. In terms of a general vibe and lore aspects, there's still a lot of groundwork to be made up towards the more war aspects of Warcraft, or previous themes that we all loved. But ultimately it's achieved its goal in setting us up for the World Soul Saga, and a true return home for what's next to come. Going through Dragonflight's lifespan, there was a decent enough start to the expansion, I thought. Dragon riding irritated me a little at first, but now I enjoy it. And the Dragon Isles to me were somewhat reminiscent of Mists of Pandaria as a levelling experience on a new isle, discovering secrets, storyline and tribes that have been locked away for a long time. However, I still think it could be improved. I don't like that some things are locked until you finish the main storyline quests, and at times the Dragon Isles can feel really disconnected from the rest of the world and Warcraft story. But ultimately, in retrospect, I did enjoy it, and I think it's fitting for what the expansion needed. I thought the initial raid of Vault of the Incarnates was okay to start off with, but things really did pick up for me with the release of Dawn of the Infinites and Aberrus. Dawn of the Infinites overall was a great experience to serve both the storyline and give us a little blast from the past, and I'd go as far to say that it's likely one of the best retail dungeons we've had in a long time, with a fairly interesting layout, level of challenge, as well as some decent boss fights and implications for the future storylines in a dungeon. But Aberrus is what really did it for me, and the cheeky little bit of bait of bringing Daddy Neltharion back, returning us towards the more heavy metal fundamental aspects of WoW, with a raid layout that appealed to me, with the first boss being a huge dragon wearing armor, progressing on to bosses who are essentially giants made of lava, and some pretty cool looking gear and insights into Neltharion as a character through those chats he had with his sons. And for the final raid of the expansion in Yggdrasil, again, big fireman with big fire axe is bad, and he's trying to blow up the world. Go stop him. It's a pretty flawless storyline in my eyes for a simple caveman brain, which was very much enjoyed. But yeah, I think once again, Farak for me was a pretty good last bad guy, even though we thought we might have ended up with someone else as the final big bad in Dragonflight. I think they handled the experience of the Timeless Isles in the build-up to getting gear, through those smaller cinematics, and heading into Yggdrasil well enough for Farak to seem like a decent threat. Well, besides that very last embarrassing final cinematic. But thankfully that won't be Dragonflight's last note, as we do have a few more patches to really tie off the expansion and set up the war within for us as per the 2024 roadmap. And as a whole, the raiding in Dragonflight for me has at least been a great experience. I'd really turned my nose up at retail WoW for the last few years, and I was loving classic WoW. Yet somehow the raids in Dragonflight, specifically from Aberrus onwards, with that lovely little sprinkle of Dawn of the Infinites, did enough to interest me in both the story, the gear, and finally having fun in retail WoW for the first time in what seems like years. It changed me from having absolutely no idea what was going on half the time, staring at what looked like rainbow vomit on my screen for each boss encounter, to mechanics that made somewhat sense, and raid structures that were easy to understand but difficult enough to make things interesting, all whilst looping in what I'd say is a fairly okay storyline. Top that off with the fact that we now know we're heading into the World Soul Saga, as well as some final patches to tie things off, and then the build-up patch to the War Within, and it's hard not to think that in many ways, Dragonflight really did recover retail WoW back to a pretty healthy state. I think the interesting thing for me has been experiencing content and an expansion that didn't blow me away by any means, but at the same time I was sat there and didn't have any negative feelings towards it, and I was thinking, this is actually just good. Not outstanding, not magnificent, but it's good. A far cry from the content and storylines we had in BFA and Shadowlands that made me and a lot of other players no longer enjoy the game and actively think it was quite bad. Now, whilst it's fair to say, and I've touched on it, Dragonflight again has not been the perfect expansion by any means, but it did deal with a large hangover from a few years of pretty disappointing and downhill decisions that all encapsulated a game that felt like it completely changed for the worse with no vision of where it was going. Dragonflight has repaired a lot of that damage, and as Chris Metzen said, provided they do their jobs right, if the World Soul Saga does pay off in the way a lot of us are hyping it up to do so, and almost believe it will do, then we'll only look back at Dragonflight as a true turning point for what the game needed in a positive way. Almost the opposite of how a lot of people view Cataclysm. But only time will tell, and it's up to Blizzard to deliver on the World Soul Saga. At first glance, it seems pretty good to me, and I'm excited for it, and they really have set themselves up in a great spot for it. From a lot of the decisions in Dragonflight and planned content on the roadmap, going up to the War Within, alongside a lot of the fan favour and popularity from decisions in classic WoW. Blizzard can go ahead in 2024 and deliver an expansion and experience that might blow us all away again, and in many ways, we might just have Dragonflight to thank for that. But do let me know what you think. Is Dragonflight good? Is it bad? Or is it just not that simple? As always, if you're new here, feel free to like and subscribe. And on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.